thank you for those of you who did submit questions. It was an interesting read, and I did my best to steer the presentation in a direction that would answer them. I'm grateful for the 15-20 minutes or so that I've now got to take you through the case. It's a case that we've been developing for 7 years. I started with World Rugby in 2015, and the first project we did was designed at asking the question about how we can reduce concussion numbers in the game. Those of you who've been involved will know that going back 10, 15 years, the focus has been on concussion for at least that long because it's the most prevalent injury in the sport. And from about 2011 till 2015, the big focus was on how do you identify and then manage the concussion. Once that's been handled, not perfectly, it never will be, but once it's been dealt with, the next question is prevention. There's a cliche in injury prevention world that the best injury is the one that never happens. And so that's the objective, is how do you reduce the number of times a player will be concussed? So that's what I want to share with you, is the process we undertook. But before I do that, I just want to start by emphasizing something, and I hope it's understood and accepted in the faith that it's offered, and that's that nobody inside the sport is aiming for zero risk. There are some outsiders who are saying that, but zero risk is a fallacy. There's no zero risk. Even not playing the sport doesn't mean zero risk. It just means different risk. We're also not trying to change the shape of the game. That's not the objective. It might be a consequence, and we have to talk and think very hard about how much change is accepted to get player welfare benefits. But that's not the point, and nor is it a reduction in physicality. So those are the three things we're not trying to do. What we are aiming for is a reduction in risk, particularly concussion, and a game that retains the fundamental principles as laid out in the charter. If we don't get those two things, then we haven't succeeded. And so it's not a question of changing the game and making it soft. It's actually a question of reducing the risk within the principles of physicality and the shape of the game. However, having said that, in order to reduce risk, there is a potential that there are going to be some impacts on elements of the game. That's a given. But the thing is, the sport is caught in a very difficult predicament at the moment because it's facing pressure from two sides. The one is saying that we have to do as much as possible to make the risk as low as possible. Now, that's a philosophical debate. And the other side is saying leave it alone. And your survey, in fact, shows that. What we're saying is that a cost is unavoidable. Doing nothing is a cost, or will have a cost. Changing height will have a cost. And any cost that you accept is basically incurred in exchange for benefits, the benefit being to reduce the risk of head injury. And so the question really is one of calibration. I don't think anyone at this point should be saying that we can afford to do nothing. There's an amateur lawsuit that was announced a few weeks back. There are professional lawsuits in half a dozen countries at the moment, pointing at the fact that the sport has neglected to manage this risk appropriately. And so there's a legal and a moral obligation to act. The question is how much action should be undertaken and what cost should we accept for the reduction in risk. So with that in mind, I want to talk to you as a community about collective and individual risk, because there's a tension here. And whilst you might not agree with this, you have to know that it's real and it exists. The situation for all contact sports at the moment is that they have to change risk, particularly for brain injuries. From the perspective of the people whose risk is being changed, there is a chance that they'll say, listen, leave me alone. I accept this risk and I don't want bubble wrap, basically, is the counter argument. The problem again for rugby as a sport is that it's facing pressure like this. This was an article, admittedly it's a number of years old now, but the same call comes up often. Why no mother should let her son play rugby. And this is a real perception, and it's a threat to the participation numbers in the sport. Now, you maybe don't buy into it, you're in the sport, so by definition, you almost have rejected this argument, but there are many who don't. What we know is that concussion is the number one player welfare priority. It is the most prevalent injury in the sport, from the elite level all the way down to the junior and community level. Data from New Zealand, where they've got a centralized medical insurance provider, shows that rugby is the largest contributor among sports to hospital admissions and serious medical claims. And a systematic review from a few years ago shows that rugby has the highest injury incidence in youth sports. So it is factual to say that rugby has a high risk of injury and makes a contribution to the overall burden of injury in communities. Now, what is that risk? And this came up a lot when England announced its change, and I'm sure it'll come up a lot for you. In the elite game, there are about 18 concussions per 1,000 hours. So if a player was to play for 1,000 hours, or players, you would expect to see 18 concussions. Now, practical terms, that works out to about 7 concussions every 10 matches. It's about 2 in 3 games. In the community game, it's a lot lower. This is your numbers. There's different data from around the world, but the Irish injury surveillance, IRIS, shows this number, 3 every 10 matches. So that's a significant reduction in the risk of concussion in the community compared to the elite game. And so on a player-by-player basis, individual risk is lower in the community game than the elite game. The problem is this: for every elite match that you watch on a weekend, there are 50, 100, possibly even 1,000 matches of rugby being played at the community. So even though the player-by-player risk is lower, the collective burden is much higher from the community game than it is from the elite game. And so from the perspective of the external body, the Irish Rugby Football Union or World Rugby or any national governing body, the community game generates more concussions than the elite game, even though the individual risk per player is lower. I hope this makes sense. Now, why is this important? It's because there's a tension between individuals who say something like, my risk is low, and I don't want to take any changes, and I'll take my chances at my risk. Unfortunately, not all of us can afford to take that position, because someone has to say there's a collective burden that's too high and our risk is too high, and therefore we need to make changes. So there's this tension that exists between me and we. And whilst you may not necessarily agree, I hope that you will appreciate that the collective is the voice that your union is speaking with in this particular instance. So with that in mind, to try and reduce the risk, you first have to understand the concept of risk. So if you forgive me for going back to basics, you don't assess risk by counting how many times something happens. You could argue, for instance, that, and many of you did this in your questions, if you watch enough rugby, you will see a lot of head injuries happen. That's not how you gauge risk, because that's a counting exercise, and risk is not counting, it's rate. And so you have to ask how many times something happened relative to how many times it could have happened. And that second part is what a lot of people forget. And I want to give you one example is, if your job was to try and control and reduce the number of deaths on the roads of Ireland, and you counted in a year, you might find 50 car fatalities and 10 motorbike fatalities. You could conclude that cars are 5 times more dangerous than bikes, and you would be completely wrong, because all you've done is count. What you have to do is you have to ask, how many times could it have happened? So for instance, per 100,000 cars, how many car accidents are there? And per 100,000 motorbikes, how many fatalities are there? And these are real numbers from the United States for interest sake. And all of a sudden now, it shows that there's actually far fewer accidents per 100,000 cars than there are for bikes. And even better, you can do it per 100 million miles. And what you discover then is that bikes are 37 times more dangerous than cars. And so the only reason counting made it look the other way around is because there's a lot more cars than there are bikes. So obviously there's more car fatalities. And so that, I hope I'm making a point that's clear without laboring it. But now what we have to do is we have to ask the same thing for head injuries. So if we want to know how many head injuries happen and which behaviors are most dangerous for head injuries, you can't count. You have to work out the rate. And that's what we did starting in 2015. So the process was, we had a video library of 611 head injury assessments in the elite game, of which 68% became concussions, diagnosed as concussions after screening. And we look at the video and we say, well, where do they come from? And this is the breakdown. So in order from lowest to largest, line out, scrum and maul, then the kick contest, then open play collisions. The ruck accounts for roughly 1 in 9, 1 in 8 head injuries. And then tackles account for 3/4 of all the head injuries in the game. Some of you asked about the ruck, and this is basically the reason the tackle has been the focus. It's not to say that we ignore the ruck, because of course the ruck is a risk. You know, 73, it's 1 in 7, 1 in 8 concussions perhaps happens at the ruck. But 75% happen in the tackle. And when we look at it as a rate, and this here is something called the risk. This is per 1,000 events. So what this is saying is that per 1,000 tackles, you'll see on average about 2 head injuries. Per 1,000 kick contests, 1.5. So you see, kick contests and tackles are equally risky. The nice thing is kick contests are much rarer than tackles, sorry. But look over here, here's a ruck. It's only about 0.3 per 1,000. So whilst numerous, rucks are relatively safer than tackles, and that's why our focus has been on tackles. Something to point out here is that within a tackle, making a tackle, in other words, the tackler, has a risk that is 2.5 times higher than the ball carrier. And so that was, and when we first did this analysis and looked at the results, this was the first paradoxical and challenging finding, because the tackler, the person who initiates the action, actually carries more than double the risk compared to the ball carrier. So now the question is, how do you protect a player from themselves? That was the first hurdle that we had to overcome, and I'm still not convinced that we've fully figured it out, but it's an important one to keep in mind. So what have we done since? And I'll show you. So in 2016, we had 464 head injuries in tackles and 147 in all other events. And then what we do is we code them to understand the set of behaviors that caused the head injury. And then we compare it to 3,500, in the end there were actually 3,500 tackles that didn't cause a head injury. Because what you then have is a set of behaviors that are safe and a set of behaviors that are dangerous, and you ask how they're different. That's effectively the method. In 2020, we repeated on 190 odd head injuries, 143 in a tackle. It was done again in 2022 in the elite game. That means that to date in men's rugby, we have 764 head injuries and 6,500 non-injury tackles that have been studied. And then recently in the women's game, I've done 114 with just over 1,500 non-injury tackles as well. So all in all, there's 878 head injuries and almost 9,000 non-head injury tackles. Out of interest, but not in this presentation, I've done the same thing in rugby league with the Australian researchers that we collaborate with. And so we have another 600 or so head injuries in tackles from that sport. And so we've got a pretty good picture. And what that picture shows you is that within the tackle, it is the tackler who sustains about 70% of all the head injuries and the ball carrier 30%. And that's the same in women as it is in men. And it's more or less the same in rugby league, slightly lower difference between tackler and ball carrier. Now, what is that study found, right? So here's the question, is what is the set of behaviors that predisposes or increases the risk to both players of a head injury? And so what we end up doing is we produce a spectrum of results where on the one side you've got actions that are more likely to cause a head injury, and on the other side in the green is actions less likely to cause a head injury. And we coded probably about 12 different variables, and I've simplified this here into 6. So for instance, tackle type. Active shoulder tackle is more likely than a passive shoulder tackle. A front on is more likely than a side on or from behind. Higher tackles are more likely than low tackles. Upright tacklers are more likely than bent at the waist players. High speed, naturally more likely than low, and accelerating tacklers are more likely than non-accelerating tacklers. Now, I'm not a rugby coach, nor was I an elite level player. And so what we did with this result is we presented it to a group of experts in Dublin in 2016. That group consisted of elite coaches. Eddie Jones was there, Paul O'Connell was in there, former players, Gus Pisho was among them, obviously Connell, some of the better women's players, Sophie Spence was there as well. And we basically said to them, right, this is the picture. You tell us how we move from right to left. Because if we could get behaviors away from the red zone and into the green zone, concussion risk would come down. And the advice of those experts back in 2016, very much the same as it is now, is that you're not going to change the tackle type. The sport is about active shoulder. It's about dominating contact, for better or worse. That's what it is. You can't change the direction of the tackle. They said you might at some point consider the speed of players and the acceleration of players into contact. In other words, line speed and its effects on injury risk. But the advice that we got in 2016 was that the height of the tackle and the body position of the players were the two, in effect, low-hanging fruits that we needed to focus on. And so that set in motion the objective in the sport, which is to bring the height of the tackle down and to change the body position of players in contact. Now, I want to make a point here that technique sits over all of these elements. And so Many of you raised this in questions. Is technique not important? It absolutely is. It's probably the most important thing. But a couple of points. The height of the tackle and the body position is one element of technique. And we've shown in this study, and it's been confirmed in subsequent ones, that they are risk factors, height and body position. From the perspective of the sport, there are already technique education programs. Yours is called, I think, Tackle Smart. World Rugby's got Tackle Ready. Every union has them. The question is, how do we drive the message to have people apply those technique issues better? That's the key point. And we felt that law was the way to do it in this instance, right? So this finding set in motion, the question for us is, how best do we reduce risk without changing the DNA of the sport? And how do we calibrate our response to reduce injury? And you'll know from watching Elite Rugby that the high tackle sanction framework, the clampdown on high tackles, that was intended to change this. Now, independent of data, and I'm still going to show you some if you are interested in it, think about two players in a tackle and understand that they've got slightly different risk profiles. How is the ball carrier concussed in a tackle? There's only really two ways. One is direct head contact by the tackler. So the tackler's head, shoulder, or arm hits the ball carrier's head. The other one is ground contact or whiplash, or I guess the ball carrier can hit his head on opponents or teammates as the tackle is completed. Now, we know in both the elite and the community game that this ground contact and whiplash is extremely uncommon. It's in the single percentage range. So more than 90% of all ball carrier head injuries are the result of direct head contact by the tackler. The tackler is a little bit trickier because the tackler's head can never really be out of the game. No matter how you tackle, your head is at risk somehow. But again, the tackler is only going to be concussed by head contact on the ball carrier's body or when his or her head hits the ground or another player's body. So the principle is, if you can keep the ball carrier's head out of the game, and if you can get the tackler's head into a safer area and on safer sides more often, the concussion risk will go down. So that's a technique issue. And I want to stress that it's not only about height, it's also about which side of the tackle or ball carrier's body that player's head is on. At the weekend, we saw an example of a very severe head neck injury, not caused by high tackle height. And again, nobody's offering tackle height as the way to prevent all head injuries. Technique still matters, but we've identified that height is a risk factor, and that's the thing that's in the focus. So now the question you should be asking is, where is it safest for the tackler's head to be? Because if we can answer that, then we can understand a little bit more about the tackler's concussion risk. So where is the tackler's head safest to be? So we ask this question, where are the tackler's head and shoulders relative to the ball carrier's body when the ball carrier is injured? And very clearly, the ball carrier is injured only by higher contact to his body by the tackler's head and shoulders. And so there's a red zone very clearly for higher contact and a green zone very clearly for lower contact. Anytime the tackler's head and shoulders are below in this green zone, the ball carrier's head injury risk is almost zero. For the tackler, it's a little bit more confusing because his head always has to be near the player. So now we say, okay, what can the data tell us about the risk of a head injury as a function of the tackler's head position relative to the ball carrier? And so this is from the 2016 study answering where is the tackler's head relative to the ball carrier's body, and it's that same risk spectrum. So the highest risk of a head injury to the tackler, remember this is to the tackler only, comes when the tackler's head and the ball carrier's head are in proximity. Then comes elbow, then knee, hip, shoulder, torso, leg. So we have a very clear red zone, and not surprisingly, it's the bony bits, head, elbow, knee. And then we have a green zone where it's the softer bits, upper leg and upper body. But the point is that those head-to-head contacts were identified as being the most dangerous for the tackler. They're also most dangerous for the ball carrier, obviously, because the only way the ball carrier gets injured is here. When we repeated that study in 2020 and 2022, the same picture emerges. And so this is now the collection of every study we've done. Head on head is the most dangerous situation for the tackler's head to be in, followed by elbow, followed by knee, then arm, then shoulder. And then we cross into the lower risk, hip, lower leg, upper leg, torso. So just by looking at that, I hope it's clear to you that if you could get rid of these ones and replace them with these ones, your head injury risk for both players will come down. Both players, even the tackler. And in particular, it's head on head and head on elbow that we need to try and eliminate or replace. Remember, because you don't eliminate a tackle. You replace a tackle behavior with another behavior, and that's the point here. So the summary is that when the tackler's head is above a line drawn more or less at the ball, top of the ball, or let's say the middle of the sternum, the risk is almost 6 per 1,000 instances. When it's below that line, it's 1.4 per 1,000 instances, and that's a difference of 4.2-fold. So what we're saying here is that a head injury is 4.2 times more likely when the tackler's head is above the sternum than when it's below it, and even the tackler has higher risk when his head is above the sternum of the opponent compared to below it. And so getting the tackler's head lower relative to the ball carrier's body will reduce head injury risk. So to come back to this, hopefully the ball carrier picture is obvious. There's a red zone if you tackle him high, and there's a green zone when you tackle them low. From the perspective of the tackler, there's a red zone for high contact where you have head on head and head on shoulder. Then there's a green zone where you have head and torso and head and upper leg. It includes the hip, which is moderately risky, but it's still part of a broader green zone. And then you get an amber zone below the upper leg, mostly because of the knee. And so the ideal position for the tackler's head is somewhere between the top of the ball and the top of the knee, which is to say the torso and the upper leg. And that's been the impetus driving this lower height trial or suggestion, is that this player, the ball carrier, is almost entirely protected without higher contact, and the tackler is relatively safer when there is medium contact. Now, a lot of people immediately react and say, but what about the knee? Nobody is saying go from the top to the bottom. They're saying go from the top to the middle. It's not a radical change from high to low. It's a nudge from high to middle. And that's the point, is a green zone where you would want the tackler's head to be in order for that player to have the lowest possible risk when executing a tackle. So, to sum it up, 16% of all tackles in elite rugby are above the sternum. They are still legal, by the way. You can tackle a player with your head. Remember, this is not where the contact is, it's where the head is of the tackler. Those 16 tackles account for almost half of all head injuries in the game. 84% of tackles account for 56% of injuries. And so 16 accounting for 44 compared to 84 for 56 means that there's a significantly higher risk when the tackler's head is above the sternum. I hope that makes sense to everyone. Not shown in this slide, because I don't want to bury you in data, is that when the tackler is upright, the risk is 1.3-fold higher than when they're bent. And when the ball carrier is upright, the risk is 1.6 times higher than when they're bent, which is an interesting finding. I'll get onto that in a moment, because there's an interaction naturally between these players. So in 2022, we looked at in fact, we've done it every time, but I'm sharing with you the latest result. In 2022, when you have two upright players, it happens 21% of the time, and it causes a quarter of all head injuries. It works out to 3.9 per 1,000 such situations. There's an example of that. You'll remember that from last year's Six Nations in the opening few seconds, in fact. When the tackler is bent and the ball carrier is upright, the risk is 3.1 per 1,000. So if you have an upright ball carrier, you would prefer a bent tackler, is the point that I'm trying to make here. So if the ball carrier is upright, the risk is higher for an upright tackler. That's that 1.3-fold risk. When the ball carrier is bent and the tackler is upright, the risk is actually quite low. It's 2.1 per 1,000. It accounts for a very small number of head injuries. When both players are bent, the risk goes up again. Now, this is an important point, and this accounts for 30% of all injuries. Most of the game, of course, is played bent. So if the ball carrier is bent, you'd actually prefer the tackler to be upright. And then finally, just for context, and this happens so infrequently, we haven't really focused on it, because it literally accounts for 1 in 300 tackles. When you have a falling ball carrier, the risk is enormous, because a player who's falling is unprotected and they're unsighted and they can't brace for contact, they can't anticipate. So what you find is that no matter what happens, the risk of a head injury is very high when the ball carrier is falling. But I want to make the point about interactions, and I specifically want to highlight this one. This is the pick and go situation where you have an upright tackler generally and a bent ball carrier, and you tend to see a soak tackle where the ball carrier's head goes into the tackler's torso. That is relatively safe by comparison with the other situations. And that's why the sport is not massively concerned with pick and goes. You can, based on evidence, lower the tackle height and still allow the pick and go because it actually doesn't contribute much to risk. And I just want to make that point. One of you asked about mechanisms and risk in women. I just wanted to share this with you because I think it's important. If you again ask the question, where is the tackler's head relative to the ball carrier's body? It can be near the head, shoulder, upper body, etc. This is how often it happens. Now, in the women's game, head-head proximity happens in 14% of all tackles. In the men, incidentally, it's 4%. And so already we see that there's something quite different about the tackle technique in women, which puts their heads in contact or in proximity much more often than in the men's game. So that's a risk factor right there. How many times does an HIA happen? What this is showing is that 45% of all the head injuries in women's rugby are the result of 14% of all tackles, massively overrepresented. Whereas, for instance, an upper body tackle happens 32% of the time, but it only causes 7% of all the head injuries. So what we can do is we can calculate a risk ratio here, and we can say, all right, there are 3 red zones: head-head, head-shoulder, head-knee. Remember, that's exactly the same picture as the men's game. Then we have 3 medium risk zones where it's arm, elbow, and lower leg. And then we have 3 green zones, which are upper body, hip, and upper leg. That pattern should strike you as being identical to the men's game. And in fact, it's the same pattern, but with even greater differences. Because in the women's game, the data we have suggests that 3/4 of all head injuries are the result of high contact tackles. Remember, in the men's game, it's 44%, women, 77%. Tackles below the line here, 23% of all women's injuries happen. In the men's game, it's 56%. And so where the men's risk was 4 times higher for high compared to low, the women's risk is 10 times higher. And all the data that we've got, incidentally, shows us that elite women, which is this data set, have the same injury risk profiles and risks and rates as the community men's game. And so that's an important point because it suggests that the same head-on-head contact is going to cause injuries in women, but disproportionately more often than they do in men's rugby at the elite level. So that's important to remember. So with all that in mind, we have a red zone, we have a green zone, and we have an amber zone. Now the key question with respect to height is, where should we set the upper limit of the legal tackle? And the 2 options have been placed at the sternum or at the waist. Now, in support of the sternum is that it's a smaller adjustment for players. It's only 10, 12 centimeters lower than they currently target, maybe 15. It provides the tackler with a larger target area than if you went to the waist, and it creates a bigger opportunity for the tackler's head to be in the green zone because you don't cut off the top part of that green zone. In opposition to the sternum, there's still a risk because if a tackler tackles the ball and goes slightly high, or if the ball carrier drops slightly low, you still get head-on-head contacts because the head is going to be above the sternum if the shoulder is at the sternum. So this sternum height might not do enough for reduction in risk, and it involves a small change. And if you want to change behavior, maybe you need a stronger message. So that's an important consideration. With respect to the waist, which is where the French trial went, there's a greater margin of error because the heads are further apart. So in theory, there might be more safety at the waist. And it's also a more significant change to drive behavior change. However, on the downside, it means that there's a much smaller target area on the ball carrier's body. And there's a smaller green zone in that target area. Imagine you draw the line there. You've basically eliminated half the green zone. And so that's the counter argument. And it's also asking players to make significant changes compared to what they're accustomed to. Now, every union, based on World Rugby's proposal from a week or so ago to look at lowering the height, has to assess these issues. These are the questions that you'll have to ask yourselves in Ireland, just as they will have to ask it in Australia and here in South Africa where I am, is where do we want to set the height? And I want to make the point that there are good arguments for both levels, because there are things in support of and there are things in opposition to. What we've done is we've developed, for instance, a scoring system, because we also recognize it's not only about medical risk. There are also factors related to player impact, risk reduction, ease of application, how it's going to impact the union and what it does to the game. And so I don't want to dwell on this too much, but basically you have to ask yourselves, will the reduction in height be effective? Will the reduction have a large or a small impact on players? Are you asking your players to change too much? If you are, then even the best theoretical solution will not work. So you have to be realistic in that respect. What is the impact on legal risk to the union? What are the important considerations for application? Of course, any change you make has to be accompanied by comprehensive coach education, officials, parents, players. So the implementation side is going to be a challenge, but that's what you have to assess as you decide what to do next. What are the requirements to implement change successfully? This is important. And then how might it affect the game? In France, where they lowered the height to the waist, they saw significant changes in the game, faster rucks, more offloading, more line breaks and scores. Some people may not think those are good. Some people think they're very good. And so there's a subjective debate that has to be had as well. We've learned some lessons in the last while, that's for sure. Number one of those is it takes time. The trials that have been done show no effect for 8 to 12 weeks. The one that was done in England was abandoned at 8 weeks before it even had a chance to do anything, which was a real shame. It damaged the understanding of these concepts enormously as a consequence of how it was implemented. But it takes time. And so what happens when you first make these changes is you will see penalties and cards go up and you won't see any reduction in risk because players have to adapt and they have to learn. And we think that adaptation only begins at 3 months. And what we recommend is at least 1 year before you even start asking whether it helps, 1 full season. The second thing is communication. In England, when they announced it a few weeks back, they said the waist wasn't well defined. As a result, it was rejected, I think because the word wasn't understood. You can create unintended consequences where you confuse players and coaches and they end up replacing one high risk action with another. And then of course it won't work. So the clarity of communication is vital. And then the other thing that is obviously key is you have to think about what else needs to be changed to assist with implementation. So for instance, you can't make a law change that affects only the tackler. The ball carrier has to be considered. So for instance, in France, they said that the ball carrier may not project their head forward into contact. In other words, bend over. What becomes of the pick and go? I've already said that there's good basis to exempt that situation from the tackle height law, and trial line defense, same thing. But some countries may not want to have a law on this, and that's their prerogative. They can do that. Same thing with the tackler assist and the second tackler. In New Zealand, for instance, they've said that the second tackler is allowed, but is not allowed a height change. In France, they said no second tackler is allowed because they were recognizing that sometimes 2 tacklers coming in at the same height creates a risk of head-on-head between teammates. And so you have to think creatively about these and come up with those solutions. I'm going to skip this because implementation is not majorly important. So these were eventually the recommendations from World Rugby, is that the recommendation is to lower it to below the sternum. Now, every union has discretion to go even further below the sternum if they wish to. But the advice was to implement consultation and to consider all the factors, including stakeholder perceptions, which is why I think this is happening now. Complementary law change needs to be considered for the ball carrier and tackler assist because it improves the viability. A period of at least 3 months before you even think about evaluating injury outcomes. And ideally, you should, I believe, allow it 1 season, preferably 2, because I think it's in the second year that players finally make the adjustments. And then member unions have discretion as to which level they apply the changes to. So it's for each union to decide. And it's well possible that some unions will go at waist height for one age group, sternum for another, and normal shoulder height for another one. It's possible that you can phase it in over time. There are arguments to be had in support of all those possibilities, and that's what the unions can do. And then, of course, comprehensive research. I'm confident that your injury surveillance program in Ireland will be robust enough to give quite good data and quite good information, regardless of what you go about doing. So that's an overview of where it comes from and what it all involved. I hope that it is comprehensive and has answered your questions.